I think one of the best things that you do is you really frame this our modern religion, the religion of pure positivity, rather brilliantly. And I guess where does Christianity and grace differ from the religion of self-help or the religion of pure positivity?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So two things I could say about that initially is, I mean, and I get this from a really beautiful book, an early book of Todd McGowan's called The End of Dissatisfaction. But in that book, he kind of articulates three different types of God that we can think about. And one is the kind of God that Freud talked about when he talked about the primal father, which is the notion of there is one exception to castration, right? So all of us as human beings are dissatisfied to some extent in our relationships, in our work, in our lives, right? That's kind of maybe a feature that unifies us all, right? But there's one exception to that, and that's God, right?
Mm.
Or in a more secular way, the one exception is the Lord who lives down the road in feudal times, the one who has everything, right? And we all are kind of suffering. So there's an exception. We are all marked by a certain lack, and there is one that lacks the lack, right? And in the Freudian thing, which is the primal horde and the primal father who has all of the sexual relations he wants and all of the resources he wants in this kind of mythical past, and then eventually the tribe get together, kill the father, and then set up some rules, right? That we're, so that nobody becomes the uncastrated other again. So that's the Freudian notion. And then there's a taboo, a memory of this uncastrated father, which is kind of the marking of religion for Freud, is that this totem of an uncastrated other, a one that lacks the lack. Now, that God really no longer exists in any substantive way, but you could say that's the God of, say, feudalism, where again, everybody goes, I'm lacking. You have to, because there's no upward mobility. There's nothing that you have to marry a particular person. You have to do a particular thing, and not a great way to live, right? But that's the God of the God of castration. Then let's talk about the modern God. You could say is the God of the demand to enjoy, right?
Mm.
And the God of the demand to enjoy is this message that infuses everything, that God's not castrated and you don't have to be, right? You can have, pure positivity, be an entrepreneur of the self, achieve, have oneness through, a certain kind of psychedelic enlightenment, or through, say, commodity satisfaction, owning a certain amount of things, through certain diets and whatever it is. Like when you go onto in social media, there's almost this sense of you're surrounded by uncastrated people. They seem uncastrated and they're selling you products that mean you don't have to be castrated, right? Now, this God of the demand to enjoy causes a whole pile of problems, which are things like jealousy and envy, social fragmentation, right? There's all this thing where everybody else seems to be having a good time except for you, or that you get the things that are supposed to work and they don't, which creates this kind of weird form of alienation when you feel like you should. I've got a friend, he's a very famous actor, he became a very well-known actor, and the alienation he felt he couldn't put words to. He said, I got everything I was told that would make me no longer alienated. I feel awful, I'm falling apart, and yet couldn't symbolize it because in a sense you've got it, right? And now this progressive position generates reactive politics, right? So some people then go to conservative churches or whatever in order to mitigate their anxiety at this pure positivity, the entrepreneur of the self, which creates fatigue, creates burnout, creates ADHD, all these symptoms that are modern symptoms, right? That this pure positivity creates. Then can often go back to somewhere like Hillsong precisely because it's easier to date whenever you've got constraints than whenever you don't, right? In LA, no one's dating whenever you're able to do whatever you want, this is what Lacan meant when he said, if God is dead, nothing is permissible, which is a
Mm.
dig at Sartre, but where he kind of means that whenever you've got whenever you're in a position of pure positivity where you can really do anything and be anything, and even the government and corporations are saying just do it, do it, do it, do it, it actually creates so much anxiety and stagnation, and you end up becoming more and more closed to the world, and you experience people being more and more toxic. You become more and more fearful of the other, and then your sexual relationships become contractual. You prefer to have an OnlyFans relationship that protects you from the toxicity of real people than the danger of a real person, right? So all of these problems that we're experiencing. So um, what is the answer? And so for me, the answer here is you have to go through to the idea that we're all castrated, including God. So in the first, we're all castrated except for God. The second, none of us need to be castrated. The third is that everything is castrated. And what that means is that a lot of us, and a lot of depression, a lot of fatigue and burnout is because we fantasize some alternative world where everything is better. If I'd been with that woman or that man, everything would have been better. So you have an philosophical alternative possible world that where everything worked out. Oh, if only I'd taken that job. And so your depression is directly connected to this fantasy of an undivided possible world that you're not in. You're in the actual world where it's shit, but you've got this vision of a possible world where it worked. If you can realize that the vision is in all possible worlds as well as the actual world, right? Then in a sense, life can be more difficult or less difficult, but you're not frenetically pursuing some end of castration. You're realizing, in fact, that there's something about sacrifice itself that is enjoyable and is good. This is where we get into the ethics a little bit. Maybe I should hold off on that for a second and say there was one other thing that I wanted to say about your question. Well, I'll say this about the ethics is that interesting thing about our contemporary economic system, and which someone like Todd McGowan and Slavoj Žižek is very brilliant on, is that the capitalist system actually gives us what we want in ways, right? And you go, they'll never gives us what we want, right? The capitalist system never gives us what we want because every time we get it, it's not it, right? Like the new iPhone 15s just come out, like, and of course, like all these basically smartphones have hit their limit, right? So, but they try to still pretend that the iPhone 15 is something special, and then you get it, and you go like, that's not it. So the traditional argument is capitalism never gives you what you want. It always dangles it in front of you, never gives it. But what McGowan argues in Capitalism and Desire is that, well, capitalism does give you what you want, because what we want is dissatisfaction. What we want is precisely not getting the thing. And this brings us very much to grace and self-help. That's brilliant. That's how I wanted to say that. But yeah, so we'll keep going with this. So capitalism in a way dangles something in front of you, but precisely by always failing to get it, there's a certain, you don't consciously want that. It causes you suffering and pain, but you're getting something that keeps your desire alive, right? So what is the problem? Well, the problem, you could say, is that you don't see your enjoyment. Capitalism hides where the enjoyment is. It pretends that the sacrifice of sacrifice is the answer. So it gives you the fantasy of winning the lottery or retiring by the beach, and you'll be able to sacrifice and finally be happy, right? Not realizing that if you retire and go to the beach and do nothing, you'll probably be dead within a year or two because you've got nothing, right? So even that's why people often work in horrible jobs rather than retire and go, why is this guy working until he's 75? Because deep down he knows that even if the work is not great, it's better than not doing anything, right? So capitalism hides the truth that there's something about sacrifice that's important, and it hides it from everybody, even hides it from the winners. In capitalism, the losers lose, but the winners even lose. The losers lose doubly. But even if you become a billionaire, it doesn't fix it, right? You just get get a nicer house, and also you're in a much better position, but you still don't get over alienation. So the answer is, how do we see and enjoy our dissatisfaction? And I'll give a concrete example of this. A friend of mine who always was getting into fights with his wife, and his wife was always blaming him for things. And in all honesty, he deserved it half the time, right? But he's a nice guy as well. And he was always getting in trouble. And he was saying to me, I'm just sick of it. He says, I've been married for 15 years or whatever. And I'm just always in the doghouse. I'm always having to apologize. I'm just done. But as we were talking, I was able to say this, and I know you, mate, like, you love to win people over. You're a natural salesperson. He's done sales most of his life in one way or another, right? And you love to win someone over. And I said, I know your partner. She loves to be won over, right? in a way, unconsciously, you guys are getting your enjoyment, right? If she puts you in the kind of metaphorical doghouse, and then you have to win her back by buying her flowers and bringing her on a nice weekend, you go like, what if you're both unconsciously enacting your enjoyment? Now, the problem is you're not enjoying your enjoyment because it's hidden, right? It's not seen. So you're trying to get away from it, right? What if you just see it for what it is? And as soon as he saw that, he just started smiling. He's like, oh, brilliant. And he went back to win his wife over. In other words, he was already getting his enjoyment. He just didn't realize it. And so he was able to now enact it in a better way. So here's the critique of self-help. Self-help goes, I want to bring you from A to B. So for example, self-help might say to him, right, here's a way to, make sure you're not in trouble as much or get into a better relationship or whatever. So moving to A to B. Grace is the technology that simply where you accept that you're accepted, which means you don't have to move from A to B, right? You sit. But what grace does is grace shows that A does not equal A. So if self-help is always how to get from A to B, grace is A does not equal A. And what I mean by that is that you are riven by an unconscious knowledge, right? You are not who you think you are, right? You think you want to get away from that disruptive practice, but you don't, right? A does not equal A. There's a whole pile of unconscious things, enjoyments going on. And what grace does is it allows you the space where you can ask this very traumatic question. What am I getting out of the situation that I think I'm just passively observing, right? So sometimes we are passively observing something, but sometimes, so for example, sometimes if you think someone's breaking into your house at night, yeah, you may have heard a noise and you don't usually hear that noise. That's fine. But if every night you think it, right? You passively think that someone's breaking into your house. You're not passively thinking that. You're actively in it and you're getting something from that. Grace provides a space where you can ask this question and symbolize, put language to that suffering and that enjoyment. And the act of being able to do that, I would argue, is fundamentally transformative. It can cheat. So not moving, simply accepting that you're accepted, seeing your surplus enjoyment is enough to radically transform the way you interact with the world. And that's grace as opposed to self-help.